Auto layout is a set of behaviors that tells your design how to adjust itself for different size windows or different amounts of frame content, stretching or shrinking horizontally and vertically as needed. And at first, you just need to understand how auto layout thinks, and then you need to learn how to make Figma actually do those things. Hopefully this video will help you get through this more quickly. And by the way, the last section of this video I'm calling This Will Happen to You, where I'll explain the most confusing details that I run into, how to deal with them, so hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. There's a lot to cover on this topic, and it might take more than one video to do it, but let's jump in. So auto layout is a term that describes these kinds of behaviors. So here's a frame. As it stretches, the contents sort of space out to fill it. We've got frames where the content shifts from one row to multiple rows depending on available space. We have frames where the gaps between objects will grow. And we even have frames that combine multiple behaviors, both for horizontal and vertical. So auto layout covers all of these topics. When you create a new frame, auto layout is not on by default. The frame on the left has a few boxes inside it, but I can drag them around freely. If I want auto layout to position these boxes, I can select the parent frame and press this very tiny icon on the right panel. And you can see now it's making sure that the boxes are arranged from left to right with an even spacing between them and even spacing all around. Figma has taken a guess at what the correct spacing and arrangement should be. You can also turn on auto layout with Shift A. Now with auto layout, there are competing forces at work that all contribute to the final appearance of your frame: the spacing between the objects inside the frame, the size of those objects, and the behavior of the frame itself. All three of those things have behaviors that are controlled by auto layout, so it's no wonder it can get confusing. So let's start our journey here with spacing. So which type of spacing will you need? You could have fixed spacing, which is the same between every object in the layer, or you could have autofill spacing, which maximizes the spacing equally between all the objects in the frame to fill it. Let's see how that works. And here, nothing changes when the frame changes. Let's take a closer look. With fixed spacing, as we change the length of the frame, as I was showing, it has no effect on the content. If the frame is too small, the layers could even extend beyond the boundary of the frame, and you can decide whether that overflow is visible or not with the clip content option here. Notice that in a frame where there's two spaces, like this one, they must match. If a frame is set to fixed spacing, then all of the spacing is the same between objects. Let's give it a try down here. So we've got a frame. It does not have auto layout on, so I'm going to turn it on here. And now let's drag these objects into the frame. As soon as I drag my first one, it's going to change the frame to something called hug, which minimizes its size. I'm going to drag my second one in and my third one. And now I have to select the parent frame. And here is where I decide what the spacing is. And it's this icon right here. If I drag this to another number, you can see that it's applying that space equally. And if you hover, it'll actually show you what the value is of that gap. With fixed spacing, you can even make it negative if you pull it far enough to the left here. I'm not sure when you would need that, but it does support it if you need it. Now let's look at autofill spacing. Now with autofill spacing, the spacing will adjust to fill any available space, and if there's multiple, it will distribute that spacing equally across them. Let's give that a try down here. Here's our frame. I'm going to turn on auto layout and drag these in again, just like last time. And now I need to select the parent frame. I can click on it here. Now, instead of using a number, you go to this pull-down menu here and you'll see auto. Now, I wish this said autofill to be more descriptive, but that's what it is. So I switch to auto, and now if I change the width of my frame, the spaces expand. And when you hover over this frame, it just says auto. And you can see that the spaces between the objects are equal. Okay, we've talked about two types of spacing, fixed size and autofill. Now let's talk about frame sizing. Autolayout can control how those are sized as well, and here are 3 ways that it can be done. Okay, if our frames are set to a fixed size and we adjust the parent frame's width, nothing happens. A fixed frame also does not pay any attention to its contents. If I change the size of this one with banana in it, it will allow me to cut off the content without any trouble. Now, the second example, where the frames are set to fill, it's very similar to the fill spacing, except here it's the frames that are expanding. So here's a frame with 3 smaller frames inside, all set to fill. And you can see what's happening here. Each frame is set to be the same size, and it fills up its parent perfectly. If the frame is set to hug contents, then it's exactly the right size to fit what's inside it. We can remove some letters, and you'll see what happens as the frame adjusts to the new content. You can even mix different types of sizing in one frame. So I want you to think about what will happen when I change the size of this frame before I pull on it. So we've got 2 fixed frames and 1 that is set to fill. If this frame grows or shrinks, that needs to be absorbed by the frame that can expand or shrink, the fill frame. Let's take a look at this next example. We've got 3 fill frames and a hug frame. So hug will be based on the content inside it, and these will fill the remaining space. So if I pull on this frame, that expansion and contraction is distributed across the fill frames, but the hug one remains the same. Also, it's good to point out that if I were to add content here, the fill frames shrink equally to absorb it. Now in this last example, we've got even more. We've got 3 hug, 1 fill, and 1 fixed. Now, if we were to expand this frame, what will happen? Well, there's only 1 that can grow, and it's the fill frame, so that will absorb any shrinking or growing of the outer frame. And if we were to change content in here by, say, adding a letter or removing letters, all of that gets absorbed by the fill frame that's in there. Now, I've got no spacing between objects on these frames just to illustrate these points, but let's see what would happen if we did add some. So I'm going to highlight these 3 frames and just add a little bit of spacing between objects. So it doesn't really change the behavior in any way. It just means that in addition to the flex behavior that we saw before, the spaces between are also preserved. All right, so the frames we've been pushing and pulling around can also have their own settings for how they behave. For example, if the containing frame is set to hug, it will always snap to contain what's in it exactly. If the surrounding frame is set to fixed, this can be adjusted anywhere we like. Now let's deal with a very common first challenge when you're learning auto layout, is how do you fill a space like a navbar, where you've got some things that are a set distance apart, like those 2 on the right, and yet we want it to fill up the entire space with a flexible space as well. This is sort of the behavior we want, but unfortunately you can't mix autofill and fixed spacing in one frame. You have to pick one or the other. Now you may already have an idea how to get around this, but let's walk through it. You are going to need to wrap your 2 fixed layers together into another frame, maybe a hug frame that holds it together like this. And that's in fact what we do have here. You can see that the width is set to hug on this. So we've got a hug frame on the left, 1 hug frame on the right, and an autofill space in between them. So this nesting of frames in order to achieve these behaviors of flexing or fixing distances is very, very common in Figma, and you're going to need to become comfortable with it. But if you understand this nesting of frames concept, then you're well on your way. Now here's a few things that will happen to you. You will see this message. It'll appear at the bottom of your screen sometimes when you make a change to one of your layers. It's not very helpful. It doesn't explain why it made the change. So I'll explain it here. And imagine you've got this situation at the top where you've got a set of frames that are either hugging their content or they're fixed in size. Now, if you were to switch one of these hug frames to a fill frame, you would have created a situation where the frame is trying to be as small as possible and the content is trying to be as big as possible. These kinds of sizing conflicts are not allowed, so Figma decides to change the parent frame to fixed size and gives you this message. I really wish Figma would warn you instead of just going ahead and doing it, maybe give you some choices, but I guess that's what the undo key is for. All right, things that will happen to you, number 2. Let's imagine you have the setup here at the top and you decide, I'd like a little extra space around the banana one. So you pull out one side of that frame to give it some breathing room. And Figma will quietly, without telling you, switch the frame mode to fixed instead of hug. Because if you're trying to add padding this way, that's Figma's only option. If you do want space around your frame contents, it's padding that you need over here. Try not to drag the sides of a hug frame or it will automatically be switched to fixed. And Figma won't tell you it did it. All right, number 3 here is a real doozy. So if I have text in a frame like this, I've set it up so that as the width of the frame changes for the text, it expands and the containing frame is set to hug height, so it's working great. So I'm playing in here, making changes, shrinking, growing, changing my layout, etc. Suddenly I make a change and my text comes out. What did I do? What happened is I lost my hug contents. It switched to fixed height. It was working a second ago though. Does anyone know what I did? Well, it turns out that if you grab the corner here instead of the side to resize your text, it will switch it from hug to fixed. I can fix it by going back to height, changing it to hug contents. But watch this again. If I select this text and grab the side, the height remains in hug mode over here. As soon as I touch the corner or the bottom and move it even a little bit, it changes. So now it's fixed. So do not touch these corners when you're playing with things that are hugging. Just stick with the sides. And it's just very easy to break something that's in hug mode, that's all. All right, well, I hope you had fun with this one. There's more to cover in Autolayout, quite a bit more. But I think that's enough for one video, and I hope to see you again soon.